Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. When we say good evening, we mean it. And tonight we want to send a special, as they say on talk radio, shout out to our most loyal and faithful viewers. We love you. We appreciate you. In fact, we think of you as all little tacos and your children as taquitos. And not just tacos and taquitos, but also enchiladas and chalupas and everything else in the Taco Bell menu. That's how we think of you. So the good news is America at this stage is getting a lot more amusing. The bad news is it's also getting a little scary. So today, in the second category, the government announced that inflation has once again set a year-over-year record. By now, we're used to this. If you buy anything, you already knew it was happening. Boy, did you. But there were parts of today's Labor Department report that were not expected by anyone. In fact, they were bizarre. They seemed to defy the most basic rules of economics. But first, here are the raw numbers. This is from a Fox News report today.
Inflation cranked up a whopping 9.1% in June, the highest yearly jump since 1981. The Consumer Price Index, released Wednesday morning, showed the price of necessities far outpacing raises. The price of gas is up almost 60% year over year. Rent went up 5.6% over last June, and food at home and dining out increasing 10.4%. If you break it down to just groceries, the annual jump was 12.2%. That includes eggs up 33% and butter up 26%.
So the biggest annual spike in inflation in more than 40 years. That's the headline. But if anything, it understates what's actually going on. The reality of it is worse than that. During the Carter years, when inflation famously hit 14.6%, wages were still going up. As Pew put it in a recent analysis, quote, during the high inflation years of the 1970s and early 1980s, average wages commonly jumped 7, 8, even 9% year over year. And that makes sense. There's more money in circulation. It's worth less, but there's more of it. But that is not what is happening right now. And that's the weird thing. According to the Labor Department report today, quote, real average hourly earnings decreased 3.6% seasonally adjusted from June 2021 to June 2022. The change in real average hourly earnings combined with a decrease of 0.9% of the average work week resulted in a 4.4% decrease in real average weekly earnings over this period. 4.4% average decrease in earnings. This is what economic disaster looks like. Americans are making less money at exactly the moment when everything they buy, from gas to groceries, is more expensive. And not just a little more expensive, a lot more expensive. Here's the big picture. The average American household income this year is about $87,000. Today's inflation numbers means the average household is losing nearly $8,000 a year just from inflation. And by the way, that's using the government's cooked numbers, the 9.1% inflation number, which is derived from the intentionally deceptive Consumer Price Index, CPI. So the real number is actually higher than that. Rising inflation with falling wages. This is very bad. And as we said, it's also very weird. How weird? Well, here's one measure of the strangeness. The price of gas is now much cheaper in Mexico than it is in the United States. And that's why so many Californians are now driving across the border to fill their cars. Now, why is this happening? That does not make sense. Oil prices set in the international market. But apart from a few outlier websites like Zero Hedge, which not coincidentally the left is always trying to shut down and censor, no one seems to be asking that question. We do know that gas prices in Mexico are so cheap that the Mexican government is encouraging more Americans to cross the border to refuel their cars. Right now, said the president of Mexico this week, a gallon of regular cost $4.78 average on your side of the border, while in Mexico it cost $3.12. So you have to ask yourself, if we're paying more for gas because of Putin's price hike, why isn't Mexico paying more for gas because of Putin too? Why is inflation up when wages are down? This doesn't make any sense. So if you want to answer those questions, you really have to look at government spending. Last month, Mexico's government did not follow the Biden administration's lead and send its strategic petroleum reserve to China. They did not do that. Instead, here's what Mexico did. They spent $2 billion in subsidies to keep gas prices lower for consumers. In other words, the government of Mexico, in the middle of a drug war, is taking better care of its citizens than Joe Biden is taking care of his citizens. And that is shameful. but it doesn't mean Joe Biden is ignoring the needy. In the very same month that gas prices shot beyond the reach of people, people aren't taking trips because of gas prices. Joe Biden, in the name of democracy, signed a $40 billion aid package, not for you or any other American, but for Ukraine. And that money, Joe Biden says, is just the beginning. It's part of our unlimited commitment to funding Ukraine's corrupt and authoritarian government. Here's Biden.
For as long as it takes. Does it mean indefinite support from the United States for Ukraine? Or will there come a time when you have to say to President Zelensky that the United States cannot support his country any longer? Thank you.
We are going to support Ukraine as long as it takes. We are going to stick with Ukraine, and all of the alliance are going to stick with Ukraine as long as it takes.
The war has pushed prices up. They could go as high as $200 a barrel, some analysts think. How long is it fair to expect American drivers and drivers around the world to pay that premium for this war?
As long as it takes. So Russia cannot, in fact, defeat Ukraine and move beyond Ukraine.
Future generations will look at that tape and many tapes like it with their jaws open. As long as it takes, whatever the cost for Ukraine. As the American economy heads toward total destruction, Ukrainians are dying in large numbers. Who's winning? Well, Ukrainian oligarchs. They're getting richer, much richer. Since January of this year, the Biden administration has sent about $8 billion just in so-called security assistance alone to Ukraine. That would include missile systems, howitzers, ammunition, radar systems, et cetera, et cetera. Now, defense contractors are making a ton from this, and that's why they have lobbied for it so hard. But you have to ask, once we send these weapons to Ukraine, where do they go then? What happens to them? These are sophisticated and deadly weapon systems. Well, no one knows where they go. No one's keeping track. U.S. officials, Biden administration officials, have admitted that to the Wall Street Journal, and we're quoting. Once U.S. equipment, materiel, is handed to the Ukrainian government, U.S. officials said they have little direct knowledge of where that materiel goes. They rely instead on the Ukrainian government for such information. The administration has not agreed to allow American military troops to conduct some oversight into that country, end quote. So you send billions to Ukraine in the middle of a war, and then you don't bother to find out what happens to it? What will happen to these weapons? Well, the Czech defense minister knows. He has said these weapons, some of them, will be smuggled out of Ukraine. Quote, it's hard to avoid trafficking or smuggling. We didn't achieve it in the former Yugoslavia, and we probably won't avoid it in Ukraine. This is lunacy. If you wanted to make Eastern Europe dangerous and unstable for generations, ensure that war continues and many more die, this is exactly what you would do. You would treat Ukraine like we treated Afghanistan. But that's just the beginning of the money we're sending. On top of all of this security assistance, now the head of USAID, that would be Samantha Power. She's never left. She's still here, amazingly, after wrecking the world. She's announced we're sending $4 billion more to Ukraine to pay off that country's budget deficit. Wouldn't that be nice? If Samantha Power decided to pay off our budget deficit, if anyone decided to help us, but no one would ever do that. So your tax dollars are now paying the salaries of Ukrainian government bureaucrats. In all, your Congress has approved more than $50 billion for Ukraine. That includes $7 billion in food assistance and health care, along with $9 billion for economic support, whatever that means. There's also $2 billion for refugee assistance. So just as we did in Iraq and Afghanistan and, half a dozen other countries, we're sending bales of $100 bills into a war zone and hoping they find the right pockets. Again, this is nuts. And yet, leaders of both parties agree we have to keep doing it. Much more of it. Dozens of Democrats in Congress just signed a letter pushing the administration, as if they needed to be pushed, to award the International Monetary Fund a total of $650 billion in new funding because Ukraine. And on top of all of that, Congressman Adam Kinzinger just proposed an amendment to the National Defense Authorization Act calling for another $100 million for, quote, Ukrainian military pilots and associated personnel. Kinzinger's the guy who thought the ghost of Kiev was real.